In our previous video, we looked at how to calculate CPI and the GDP deflator. Now let's look at how to use CPI or the GDP deflator to calculate inflation. So once we have CPI or the GDP deflator, what we do to calculate inflation is look at the change. So anytime you look at change, whether it's economic growth or inflation rates, it's new minus old. Let's just write that down quick. New minus old divided by old times 100. So let's look at some Statistics Canada data and calculate the inflation rate using CPI, and then we'll go find the GDP deflator and we can compare. We talked in the previous video about the differences between GDP deflator and CPI, so let's see if they give us similar inflation rates. All right, so I'm just going to see about making some space here. All right, so let's go find some numbers. So let's go into the Stats Canada website. And if we are looking for CPI, of course, we can see under the key indicators, the Consumer Price Index. So we'll just get that to open here. And with all the key indicators, it summarizes the most recent data up top, but we can scroll down and we can get more detailed information. So I'm going to choose table 2, even though we're just going to look at Canada data, because you might be looking for province-specific data, and we just want to show how that works. So while this is a summary here showing the most recent information, so we can see the CPI for August 2021 for Canada was 142.6. So what does that tell us? It tells us there's been 42.6% inflation since the base year, and the base year, according to this chart, was when? 2002. Now we can also see the year over year, so it'll actually calculate the inflation rate for us. And so we can see from August 2020 to August 2021, we can see the two CPIs. We could do new minus old divided by old times 100, and we should get 4.1%. Well, I'm actually going to go and pick some older data. So I'm going to click on that table below. And here we can specify the time period and the geography. So if I wanted to find specific for Alberta, I would just scroll down here to Alberta. Right now we'll just look at Canada data. And let's look at August. And let's look at August 2019 to August 2020. So you can pick a range. If you happen to be doing a comparison with the US or between provinces, of course, you want to make sure you're comparing within that same time period. So let's just apply that here. And what we're looking at is we're looking at the CPI for all items. You can specify and look at CPI for specific industry. And in fact, we'll look at that in just a moment. But right now, we want to calculate the inflation rate, and we want to go from August 2019 to August 2020. So we can see August 2019, the CPI was 136.8. August 2020, the CPI is 137. So if we hang on to those numbers, let's just write them here. So August 2019 was 136.8, and August 2020 was 137. So to calculate the inflation rate using CPI, it's new minus old divided by old times 100. So we take 137 minus 136.8 divided by 136.8 times 100. We'll put that into our calculator, and what we end up with is 0.0015. We multiply that times 100, and we are ending up with then 0.15%. So from August 2019 to August 2020, there was very little inflation. And let's think about that period of time. So in February and March, we start to see the impact of COVID-19. So for about half of that period of time, businesses are closed in the summer, has a big impact on purchasing. And if people aren't buying things, then of course we know that decrease in demand makes prices decrease. So likely what we had was inflation for the first half of the year, and then deflation for the second half, turning into a almost 0% increase in prices over that year. If we compare that, right, to what we saw, if I go back twice here. So notice here from August 2020 to August 2021, there, if we take 142.6 minus 137, divided by 137 times 100, we're going to get 4.1%. So significant increase in prices here. And that's because once we start to see reopening of businesses at the end of the summer in 2020, then we have people who weren't able to go on trips to do things, so they're going to start spending lots of money. We also have supply chain issues that are disrupting production. And so remember, a decrease in supply drives up prices as well. So a decrease in supply drives up the price, an increase in demand drives up the price. And so you can see from August 2020 to August 2021, there's a lot of inflation. And that's because in that previous year, there wasn't a lot of inflation. So you can see the impact here of COVID. Now, this is consumer price index that the inflation is based on. So this is looking at what households buy. Now let's look at the GDP deflator. Okay, so a good place to go to get a GDP deflator is Trading Economics. So here we are in the Canada section. You can look up the GDP deflator for other countries as well. GDP deflator is a measure of what's happening with prices. So we click on prices here, and you can see the GDP deflator. Now, if we want to compare inflation with CPI versus inflation with the GDP deflator, we're going to need a similar period of time. So we're looking for around August 2019 and August 2020. Now, the GDP deflator is reported in quarters, so 4 times a year. So if we're looking at August, we're looking at about the third quarter. So here we have July 2019. So this 109.9 would give us around August. And then if we go July 2020, this 111.4 would give us the August of 2020. So let's write those numbers down. So we'll do, so here we have third quarter 2019, and that number was 109.9. And then we have third quarter of 2020, and that number was 111.4. So same process for calculating the inflation rate, new minus old divided by old. So 111.4 minus 109.9 divided by 109.9 times 100. So remember, we're going to do that subtraction first. 111.4 minus 109.9, get that number, divide by 109.9. And then when we do that, we get 0.0136, and we'll multiply that times 100, so we end up with 1.36%. So notice here that with the GDP deflator, we have 1.36% inflation, and with CPI, we have 0.15% inflation. So that takes us back to the discussion we had in the previous video about the difference between the CPI and the GDP deflator. So what were the differences between? Remember, the consumer price index is what the household buys, so that's just C. It does include imports because some of the things households buy come from other countries. and it is the same goods year after year. It's that bundle. Whereas the GDP deflator is all the parts of GDP, so C plus I plus G plus X minus IM. So we're taking out the foreign goods and just looking at the domestic ones. It allows for substitution because we could buy different things. And the key here is really that it includes the purchases made by businesses and government, those capital goods. And so when we see a higher inflation with the GDP deflator than we do with the CPI measure for inflation, what that's telling us is the capital goods, their prices are increasing quicker than the consumer goods. Okay. So the tools, the equipment, what the businesses are using to provide the consumer goods, those prices are going up. So the cost of the business is going up. And you can see here a bit of an attempt of businesses not to necessarily pass that on to households in terms of that final consumer goods product price. All right, so we look here at inflation. We can see that prices have been going up. We can measure that with CPI or the GDP deflator. I said earlier that we could take the inflation information and we could actually break it down and look at it by what's happening. Actually, let's go back in. So here was by province, but if we went here into this link, we could see inflation for a period of time by these different types of goods or products. So you could look at what's happening with the price of gas for any period of time, right? New minus old divided by old for your CPI for gasoline. Now, if you just want a quick measure of what's happening currently, then we can actually see here on this chart a kind of a focus. So this is looking at meat prices and what's been happening to them. And this looks at from August 2020 to August 2021 in that dark purple. So they're just looking at a particular area of interest. But there's also typically in this graph a breakdown of, there we go. There's usually a breakdown by those different industries. So you can see here in the dark blue, the August 2020 to 2021, where has the greatest price increases come? And it's been in transportation. If we look at gas prices, they've gone up considerably in the last year from a multi-year low and have gone up. You can see that clothing and footwear has fallen. That's the only little negative one that we see here. So we can see where we're seeing the most price increases by industry. Let's go back to our slides here. We can look at inflation over time. So here you see the CPIs for many years. And again, new minus old divided by old times 100 gives us the inflation rate. And that's what I've graphed here. So in fact, this graph goes back to 1915. And so you can see here, just make sure my numbers are really small. Oh, let's take that back. Okay. So we had some changes with the gold standard in early beginning of the century. And so those are the first couple dips. But here, that's the Great Depression in the early 1930s. You can see other little tiny dips here. These are other recessions. Okay. We can see periods of high inflation. Remember we talked about this 1970s. You can see that there. What do we call that period in the 1970s? With high unemployment and high inflation, call it stagflation. Okay. Now in Canada, since 1991, so let's find 1991-ish here. Here's 1991. Notice that there's a lot less variability in inflation. That's because since 1991, the Bank of Canada has made it a priority to keep inflation between 1 and 3%. So you can see really here that it's been a top priority and something that they actively use monetary policy to keep it in that range. The idea here is that economic growth, that increase in demand for goods, drives up prices. So we want a little bit of inflation, but not too much inflation that you can't afford the things that you need. And so we're keeping those prices right between 1 and 3%.